Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Keith Edwards, filling in as guest host for Heather Shea. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach. You can find more about me at keithedwards.com. Student Affairs Live is part of the HigherEdLive network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education, like we have here today. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Thank you to Brian David Proffer for tweeting through the HigherEdLive account and monitoring today's back channel. If you have questions for our panelists or comments, please tweet the hashtag HigherEdLive. We'll do our best to incorporate them into today's discussion. Heather Shea and Tony Duty broadcast approximately twice a month on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. All of the episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take HigherEdLive with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. In a moment, I'll introduce our panelists joining me today to talk about the Intro to Student Affairs courses. But before I do that, I need to give thanks to those who make these free webcasts possible. Today's episode is sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover other opportunities, including upcoming events, professional development, and convention, which you can register for. You can learn more by visiting the link we're tweeting out now. Student Affairs Live is also sponsored by mStoner. Want to win a day of brand and storytelling consultation services? mStoner and their branding partner, BVK, are giving away a customized full day of digital storytelling and brand-focused consultation services to the winner of Pitch Perfect 2, Enter the Shark Tank. They're looking for institutions ready to push the envelope, chart new territory, and take your brand and communications to the next level. 3 teams will pitch their upcoming brand and/or redesign project to an esteemed panel of judges and a live webinar audience. When you submit an application, you're entered into a random drawing to win access to mStoner's on-demand professional development courses. The application deadline is this Friday, June 27th at 11:59 Pacific time. We'll be tweeting a link to the application out shortly. Now, on with today's episode. We have a great group of folks here who have lots of different experiences around Intro to Student Affairs courses for undergrads, from those in the standalone course to massive open online courses to research on the impact and the design of these. So we have a really rich discussion. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with these folks. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit about them. If you could share your name, pronouns, and your day job, as well as your connection to these student affairs undergraduate courses. And Erich Pitcher, we're going to start with you. And you're on mute. There you go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Erich Pitcher, and I use they and he pronouns. I work as a program lead at Oregon State in adult and higher education.
And your connection to the student affairs courses for undergrads?
Sure. I taught 2 different sections of a leadership course that is designed to both give students a leadership experience, but then also introduce them a bit to the field of student affairs.
Awesome. Glad you're here. And Amy, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Dinise-Halter. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work at Colorado State University. My day job is a student success manager, but I have a dual appointment as an assistant professor in our Student Affairs and Higher Education master's program, where I teach the MOOC, which is how I'm related to helping undergraduates learn more about student affairs.
Thank you. Glad to have you here, Amy, and go Rams. Susan, over to you. Nope, we can't hear you. We need to unmute you.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I'm Susan Iverson, and I'm faculty in higher education leadership at Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York. And I also direct the doctoral program here. And my scholarly interests are around diversity and equity and status of women, and also pedagogy, which connects me with this area because I collaborated with some graduate and doctoral students on the development of an undergraduate careers and student affairs course, which with Brenda McKenzie and Kyle Reynolds, we also studied and have an article, and we'll talk a little bit about the research from there. My preferred pronouns are she and her.
Thank you. And over to Erich Archer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erich Archer. I'm an assistant professor of higher education leadership at Western Michigan University. My pronouns are he, him, his. My research area centers on internationalization of higher education. And my connection to this topic is I've been associated with 2 institutions, including my current one, that have offered undergraduate coursework in higher ed student affairs. And I've had some role supervising adjuncts and graduate students teaching those courses, helping design those courses, etc. Thanks.
Great. And I think we're over to Brenda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda McKenzie. I'm faculty and program director of the Higher Education Administration program at Vanderbilt University. I have previous experience teaching an undergraduate course, and as Susan mentioned, we've done some research on the impact of such courses that we'll talk about in a little bit. Pronouns, she, her, hers.
Great. And last but not least, over to my fellow Terrapin, Darren Pierre.
Yes, fear the turtle, fear the turtle. My name is Darren Pierre, and I'm a clinical assistant professor in the higher education program at Loyola University of Chicago. My pronouns are he, him, his. My connection to this topic is a little bit different in that I taught this course, but I taught it where it was a blend between higher ed master students and students who are coming from K through 12 sector. And so where I come from this in the conversation is how do we talk about student affairs, a student affairs course like this when people don't come with the background of it? And so how do we think about the entry points to how people engage into these conversations, whether it's as an undergraduate or whether someone's in a discipline that's separate from higher education?
Awesome. Well, we're so glad to have all of you here from these different perspectives, having taught in different formats and research. And so really eager to jump into this conversation. One of the things that was very clear as we were kind of leading up the discussion and looking into this is there's so many different ways these student affairs courses for undergraduates are offered, including, as Darren just alluded to, for graduate students who aren't in a student affairs in a higher education setting. We've already identified a couple different formats for MOOCs, but I'd love to hear from some of you about some of the most common ways and some of the most varied ways these are structured and offered, and what are the benefits to the students, to those teaching, to the institution, to the profession. So I think Erich, we're going to have Erich Archer lead us off here. So Erich, maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the structures and benefits here.
Sure. My experience with undergraduate coursework really runs the gamut. From one-off courses, maybe a department will create 1 or 2 courses and offer those to undergraduate students, and that's been my experience at 2 institutions I've worked at. Also, sometimes those courses meet general education requirements for an institution, and so then you're going to have a sort of a spectrum of different students that are taking the course, both for an introduction to the field, but also for general education requirements for their degree. There's also minors, and that's also something I'm working on here at Western Michigan University, is developing a undergraduate minor program out of our department. And then even some institutions have majors. And I know Brenda McKenzie and I were presenting at NASPA last year and had a gentleman from Bucknell telling us about their program that's a undergraduate major. I think some of the benefits that come with this, obviously enrollment, right? That's a lot of departments do this for, increasing their enrollment. I think it's creating pipelines to graduate programs. So sometimes we have these students, in our courses and they develop an interest and move on into our graduate programs, sort of undergraduate professional preparation, and maybe bringing in some pre-concepts before students enter into, graduate programs.
Great. And Amy, you've done this MOOC. I think you were leading the first one. I don't know if it's the only one, if there are others, but tell us a little bit about how this kind of came to be and what it's like to have a massive open online course in student affairs for undergraduates.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. So the MOOC was started by CSU in collaboration with NASPA about 6 years ago. And it really was intended to kind of fill the gap between undergraduate students who were interested in going into graduate programs, but didn't have a whole lot of knowledge or working background of student affairs. Maybe they experienced it as a student leader, but hadn't yet experienced theories or theory to practice like concepts. And so the MOOC covers both that, in addition to some of the history of student affairs, the future of student affairs, and then it offers helpful tips and processes for applying for graduate school. So it's really intended to be a pipeline for undergraduate students who are looking to go to graduate school. What's interesting is before I actually taught the MOOC, I had undergraduate students who took it, who, like many of us have probably experienced, have said, I want to go into student affairs, and had two really interesting opportunities with that. One student who took it got a ton out of it, actually was interacting in the discussion modules and forums with people she then met at interview weekends for different programs and things like that. So it kind of created that community. And then I had another student who took it and realized, no, I don't want to go into student affairs at all, which I think is as beneficial in some ways too, to our profession, so that people, especially undergraduate students, understand there is a practice and a process and a lot of theoretical background to what we do. It's not just about being an RA or an orientation leader for the rest of your life. And so the MOOC has 9 modules. It's completely free. It runs every fall. It starts this fall on September 10th. It is open for registration August 20th. And we usually get about 2,000 people who enroll and have about a 15% completion rate, which seems really low, but actually that's quite high for MOOCs. MOOCs have about an average 6% completion rate. The other thing we've learned about the MOOC is that it actually appeals to those who are supporting student affairs professionals or our colleagues who might have a social work or counseling background and now are working in student affairs roles, to just get some of the theory and background of the profession. And everyone who completes it gets a certificate, which people have added to their resumes and use in support of jobs in the future.
Great. I appreciate you sharing that. I was going to ask about the completion rate. I know that's difficult. I myself have signed up for several MOOCs that I haven't done much with, but fully intend to eventually when I get to it. I think this is really interesting because we're talking about the benefits to enrollment and pipelines for graduate programs. And I'm really glad to hear that these are pipelines, not just to my graduate program, but to other graduate programs that might be a great fit. I think one of the things that often comes up in my conversations is, do we need to be encouraging more student affairs, people to get into student affairs? Do we already kind of have a saturation? I think so. I'm really encouraged, Amy, to hear that people are using that MOOC as an opportunity to find out, is this really the right thing for me? And just as valuable to find out, oh, this isn't for me. I think that's really great before you spend 2 years in a master's degree and move halfway across the country to discover that. Free MOOC is a better way to do that. Well, I think I appreciate folks chiming in about sort of some of the structures and some of the benefits. I also like to talk about some of the challenges in teaching these courses. So Susan, would you kind of lead us off on some of the challenges of these courses and managing them?
Yeah, and I'll quickly just echo what you and Amy were also saying, because Brenda and I found just to that benefit that an unexpected benefit was people deciding this wasn't what they wanted to do. And we saw that as really worthwhile. But the challenge is, this isn't unique to just this course, but it was apparent to us in instruction of this course. Those who are typically teaching it have themselves been through student affairs, higher ed, graduate programs. And so that's kind of the content that we think about when we're delivering this undergraduate course. But 2 risks can come up. One, that there's redundancy in then what the student is going to encounter in their graduate program. And so how to differentiate the curriculum in the way that both understands, if you're teaching student development, what does it mean to a junior or a sophomore in college versus what it means for a graduate student? And so how do you differentiate that curriculum in a way that meets them where they're at, as well as assesses and understands their developmental readiness for the material? So I think that's a key piece for designers and instructors of the course to keep in mind.
I think that's such a great point. I know many of us often have these transformative experiences, both professionally and personally. And then we might want to share those with sophomores or juniors and seniors when they may not be ready for that. And so how do we not fall in the temptation of trying to replicate our transformative experiences for others? And so your point about readiness and developmental readiness is really important. Amy, you've, with this massive open online course, have been really engaging people well beyond Colorado State, and that's brought some challenges.
Yeah. So the MOOC has actually attracted people from all 50 states and from every continent across the world. And so that's been a really interesting challenge for my co-teacher and I, Bobby Kuntzman. We're teaching US-based student development and social justice, and all in the context of US higher education. Which creates, the MOOC is supposed to be interactive, and so it creates an interesting dialogue that is beneficial in the long run. But as we tried to design activities or even talk about student development theory or social justice, we think about it from this US context. And so it's been a challenge to, at the 30,000-foot view of a MOOC, what it could be, try to address it in an international audience, and still are figuring out the ways that works best for everyone. So that we can continue to help people have an overview of the profession so they get into the weeds when they're in their graduate programs, but also not be so US-centric in how we're doing the content of the course.
What a wonderful challenge to have that opportunity. And Erich, you've been, as you mentioned, you've been working with this, Erich Archer, you've been working with this on your own campus as an enrollment and getting numbers and all of that, but that brings with it some challenges too.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I think just at a basic level, one of the challenges really comes to marketing and sustainability. So who are you going to be targeting, in these courses? Is this going to be for, any undergraduate students? Is it for a particular type of undergraduate student who's interested in the profession and maybe wants to get us, a sneak peek like we've talked about earlier? I know previously I was at Northern Illinois University, and we had, an undergraduate course on the books, but for many years it only, attracted maybe 3 or 4 students, and it was always canceled. So when I was there, I had to do a lot of work to, get the word out about the class and to get students enrolled. And that was working with some other departments and having them count the course towards gen ed or elective requirements. And so that really takes a lot of work if you're going to, develop these courses and make sure that they're sustainable for the long term.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming you've wondered, is it worth it?
That's a good question. I think for me, yes, it is. But I think that's a question that you have to ask yourself as a faculty member or a department. Is this, are these resources that we want to put into this, particularly when often many of our focus in our departments are on graduate education. So do we really want to put those resources into this new undergraduate thing that our faculty aren't used to?
Right. Great. Well, we're gonna get into some of what we're learning from the research on these courses here in a little bit, but I just want to open up to any other folks who haven't had a chance to get in here yet about maybe some different structures that we haven't mentioned, some different benefits, or some different challenges.
Yeah, I have one thought. So part of the way that I thought about the undergraduate course was how could we offer a beneficial educational experience that's not exclusively directed towards the field and building the field, sort of to the point of how many student affairs professionals do we need, and how many spots for jobs that would be meaningful work can we really fill? And so part of what the plan was in the department I worked in on this project and on this course was really to think about how do we just give somebody some general leadership skills and a little bit of a sampling of what it might be like to be in student affairs without sort of wedding them to the idea that they would become student affairs professionals, but instead you'll need leadership skills in everything that you do. These are some generic skills that will sort of help you get there. And also let's try to raise a little bit of consciousness around there is this thing, it's called student affairs. You could do that thing, or you could do lots of other really meaningful work. So trying to balance both the sort of general leadership skills with the, we'd love to see you in student affairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great point about making an invitation rather than a sales pitch, and making sure that folks who decide it's not for them, as Amy was mentioning, still find value in it. And so, if I end a course thinking I don't want to do student affairs, I would still hope they would feel like, well, this is still valuable to me anyway in so many different ways.
And Keith, I would want to add on to what Susan had shared earlier, that I think it is so critical for us to trouble what are the experiences in the curriculum that we're doing for undergraduates versus what we're going to do for graduate students. The developmental spaces that a graduate student is going to be versus the traditional undergraduate experience are going to be very different. So that's one. And pedagogically, one of the things that I did different with this course was I had more of a panel discussion, so it was more seminar based, versus when I teach in traditional form where I will utilize text to germinate the conversation. And then we had panelists from 3 different areas. We had panelists who were faculty in student affairs programs. We had upper level leadership in student affairs divisions. And then we had leadership from NASP and ACPA. So you can see what it looks like from the Higher Education Association. You can see what it looks like on the institutional level in terms of leadership. And then you can also see what it looks like if you decide to go faculty. And so whether you decide that student affairs is the field for you or you don't, you can get diverse perspectives from diverse spaces in which people enter and contribute into the field.
Yeah, that's great. I think some of the best lessons I still think about for my master's degree at Colorado State a long time ago was just learning from panelists, people who had been in the profession, left the profession, done other things, and some of those things were really rich. So I'm glad to hear you're doing that. Well, we've kind of talked about some possible structures, some different ways of formulating this, some of the benefits and some of the challenges, but we've got these wide-ranging faculty here to talk about research. So I think particularly Susan and Brenda want to jump in here about some of what the research is telling us about how these courses are effective. And Brenda, we haven't gotten you in here yet, so let's get a chance to hear from you. What are we learning from the research on these courses for undergraduates?
Yeah, so what we're really seeing is the impact. Oh, I guess it would help if we're seeing the impact of those courses on decision making in terms of whether or not I really want to pursue a graduate program in this area. And so the research that Susan and I did was looking at students who had participated over 4 years of a course designed to introduce people to what does it mean to work in higher education and student affairs, and is this a path for you? And what we really found was that by designing it in a way that created an immersive experience, sort of what's it like in the graduate classroom, and hearing other professional stories, kind of like what Darren was mentioning as well, that people saw different pathways and what the work meant. So it got them out of their box of, oh, I've been involved in Greek life, and that's what it means to work in student affairs. It gave them a chance to really analyze what the experience would be like and make a decision based on that through some job shadowing and reading graduate level literature and hearing other people's stories. And really spending some time thinking about what do I want out of a graduate program, because those are so varied as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to give Susan a chance to jump in here.
Sure.
Well, first, before I speak about the literature, I did want to give a shout out that our co-author on this project, Kyle Reynolds, when he was a master's student with another student, Courtney Bush, were the ones that started the course. And I just name that because sometimes we feel like these courses need to originate by faculty or even by full-time professionals. And they were first-year graduate students that were the ones that launched this whole idea and unveiled it as an internship in college teaching. So I just put that out as kind of creative ways to think about how to do this. A key piece that came out of the research, we framed our thinking around this using Kolb's work around learning styles and experiential learning, and reflection is so critical. And so whether you're developing a undergraduate course or not, you can really apply this because we're all encouraged to be reflective practitioners and the meaning making and sense making that comes from that. And I think some of the key ways that students were making sense of their undergraduate experiences and then how that was informing their career decision making were these opportunities both in class discussion and in reflecting through some journal writing on what they would do. And it helps to mediate then some of what other scholars call this reality shock, when we leave sort of the safety net of our undergraduate academic experiences and so-called go out into the real world, is that this course was a bridge for them in that transition in many ways. And I think that's important for us as practitioners and educators to think about, how do we socialize so that there's not as much as this reality shock. And courses like this and incorporating reflection are helpful in doing that.
And what I might add to that is that as we talked with students who were currently in graduate programs, one of the points they really came back to was how their experiences in the course benefited them in creating more intentional thought about what they wanted to get out of their program, where to do assistantships, where to do practicum experiences. So that reflective piece was really important, as were some of the job shadowing and mock interviewing pieces that gave students a better sense of what the work is like.
And I'll just quickly amplify. We heard from the, and we looked at what the project did was followed students over 5 years in this course. And so some of them were still undergrads, but others had gone on afterwards, had graduated and were in graduate programs or elsewhere in their professional lives. And job shadowing, I think, is an incredibly underutilized piece. It was something that was a dimension of the course. But as Brenda and I also looked at some of the literature, it shows that job shadowing experiences significantly sort of intervene on kind of some of that transition shock when you move into the professional world. So I think it's a piece, again, whether you incorporate it in an undergraduate course or think of where else in student leadership development you can have more of those experiences, they're meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks to both of you for sharing a little bit about that research. We did get a tweet out with the full citation for people who want to look that up and get more of that. People can find that at the HigherEdLive hashtag. We've heard some of the formal research, but many of the rest of you have been teaching this class and maybe seen that or evaluations you've done or your own assessment or stories from students. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to chime in here with maybe different outcomes, different patterns that you're seeing, or things that are very similar to what we heard from Brenda and Susan through their research.
Keith, I would just echo what was already been said. In my experience with teaching and supervising graduate students teaching these courses, is that students, the reflection's important. They learn a lot about the profession. They decide whether they want to go forward, and sometimes they don't want to go forward. And I think that is just as important.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we've got some brilliant minds here with lots of experience around this. So let's get to some suggestions. I'm assuming that we have some people who are watching this or will tune in later who have been thinking about whether they should create a course for undergraduates about student affairs, or have been planning it, haven't gotten to it yet, or maybe are launching one here in the fall. So what suggestions would you have about folks who are contemplating this going forward based on your experience? And I think, Darren, we're going to start with you here. Yeah,
I'm so glad to have this conversation right after what Erich said, because I think it's just as important for you to know that this is for you as it is that's not for you. And so where I would say for people who are thinking about developing a course like this, a promising practice would be to have conversation about supervision. People don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And we know from the research that over 60% of all new professionals leave within the first 6 years of joining the profession. And so I think a course like this, an undergraduate course, is such a great way to maximize our effectiveness in making sure that people are fully prepared and empowered to understand what are some of the vulnerabilities of the profession. One of those being is supervision, not being able to be powerful in how you articulate what your needs are from your supervisor and discerning what your expectations are of your supervisor of you. The other piece is around vocational discernment. And it was so fun because this summer I had students who were linking the social change model, which is often introduced in undergraduate leadership courses. They were bringing that in to talk about student affairs. And I was like, how do you make this linkage? But then over time I got it. It's so clear. Consciousness of self. Do I love fraternity and sorority life because I was a participant? Do I love it because I want to contribute and I want to elevate that experience for people in the future? And those are two distinct answers. Neither one is bad or good, but they certainly should be part of your conversations. You trouble whether you should do this for yourself. Great text that I think people should look at. Ashley Toll has done a great job of really talking about synergistic supervision. And so she has some articles that have been published by that. Her research has been around synergistic supervision. I think that's great. I think Arthur Chickering's work, Arthur Chickering's book on spirituality and authenticity in higher education, really thinking about what matters to you. Sharon DeLo's Parks, Big Questions, Worthy Dreams is another one. But again, these are universal concepts of whether you go into student affairs as a profession or not. Understanding what you need from a supervisor, understanding who you are, and allowing who you are to inform your vocation, I think will help us with some of that vulnerability that we see in terms of our high attrition rates within the field.
Awesome. Great suggestions and great book recommendations there from Darren. Brenda, what suggestions would you have for folks?
You know, I want to echo what Darren just said, because I think one of the challenges we saw as we first started thinking about our research project was, how do people get into this field? And a lot of it is a mentor, a role model, a supervisor saying, hey, I think you'd be really good at this, but not really doing some of that deeper work that Darren was talking about. So I think that really is important in thinking about, if you're going to offer a course like this, how do you build that aspect of self-exploration into it? I think also who could and should teach, and Erich mentioned this as well, it gets complicated in departments when faculty have load requirements and now you want to add another course. Who's going to teach that? What does that mean for teaching load? If student affairs professionals are going to teach it, what do they need to know about the process of submitting a course proposal and going through that approval process? So there's a lot of layers that I think we don't always mention of, oh, just create a course. It's so easy, but it's not that easy. Sometimes, some campuses, it's easier than others. And I think there are ways to think about this that, while we're speaking specifically to courses, you could design some of this in co-curricular ways too.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask about that. I mean, I think most people's pathway to the profession is through their student leadership experience, whether that's in fraternity and sorority life, whether that's being an RA, whether that's being an orientation leader, whether that's a student employment position. And as a profession that values the experiential learning and the doing, where is the line between where we're starting to say real learning happens when you have a course, and where can that happen in other places? And then I think you just sort of skipped over that to the deeper question, which is, how do we integrate what's valuable about these courses into where maybe we don't have the courses, into RA training or into other student leadership experiences? So I'd love to hear from folks about this notion of classroom learning and out of classroom learning, and how do we blend this to best benefit students?
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts, because I think you're raising a really critical point. I mean, the heart of student affairs is about the whole co-curricular realm. But that doesn't mean that we can't consider some curricular practices more intentionally in how we do that work. I mean, just think of any student leadership program, paraprofessional training like RA training. Do we think about differentiated learning objectives from the first year RA to the second or third year RA? Or when we design a student leadership development program, in what ways are we assessing developmental readiness and or differentiating curriculum across their class standing? So I think there's a lot of things that, and I'm not saying all that happens in curricular design either, but these are components that are part of sort of thinking about curriculum, that anyone can carry these into reflective practice, how critical that is. And I think that if we more intentionally modeled that and incorporated it in whether it's undergraduate student affairs courses, or I would advocate even more strongly, all of the co-curricular life elements, then those graduates are more likely to then demonstrate reflective practice in their careers because it would have been modeled for them along the way.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion that to be developmentally sequenced about the learning and how do we differentiate that for different folks outside the classroom, and a great caution, we don't always do that within the classroom. And you're reminding me of a lot of the work that I do with schools implementing a curricular approach to residence life, orientation, or things like that. In theory, there's lots of differentiation between first years and sophomores and juniors and seniors, but many of them find that in reality, those juniors and seniors need to be having a similar conversation. There's not as much differentiation as we would think there would be. And that creates a challenge between what you would do conceptually, where we would hope people are at, and where they're actually at. So such a great conversation. Erich, you've done a lot of thinking, Erich Pitcher, you've done a lot of thinking about the pedagogy and the structure and the design of these courses, kind of hitting on some of these themes. So what suggestions would you have for folks who are considering these courses?
Well, a couple things come immediately to mind. One of which is, how do you try to balance what it is that you're there to teach, whether that's outside of the classroom or directly in the classroom? So balancing the course learning objectives with trying to give a realistic and honest appraisal of the field, right? And so Darren earlier mentioned about the mass exodus that happens within the 5 years. Much of that is related to the institutional context, the organizations within which we find ourselves, and the constant sort of churning of leadership that happens. And so how do we both present the field in as positive of a light as possible, but also in a realistic light that says things might be challenging in your first professional job, and you might still find some of those challenges in yet your second professional job or third. And how could we try to set people for success before they enter the field in that way? Another piece that I think we need to be really thoughtful about is that we often use insider language that is not always going to bring folks along with us along the conversation. And so we throw out acronyms and we talk about student development theory like everybody knows what that is. And we have a whole set of assumptions that we make about students and the field and the work that we're not always super explicit about saying and naming up front, right? And having a willingness to say, probably you might not ask a question about a thing that you don't yet know. And so how do we try to meet folks where we think they might be at, to try and ensure that we're bringing everybody along in the conversation and that folks are not over there with the acronym table trying to figure out what it is that we're actually talking about. And then I think one other piece is that we haven't talked as much about is that the values of the profession have shifted some from where we were historically to where we are now. And one of those values is around social justice work. And this is and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that this is somewhat contentious within our field. And some folks see this as the core part of what we're here to do in student affairs, and others see this as peripheral to what we're doing in student affairs. And so part of what I try to encourage as you're developing is to give students some strategies around how are you going to manage what your institutional mission is, what the profession's values are, and where your unit actually is. And whether its readiness to engage in deep, meaningful social justice work is present or not. But then also, I think, how do we define social justice work? Sometimes social justice comes to stand in for diversity and inclusion these days, and not so much about issues of power. So how are we going to talk about issues of power in a way that's broadly accessible, that brings lots of folks into the conversation, but that also asks us to think about our own positionalities within that.
Yeah, some really, really great suggestions as we were thinking about this. You reminded me of the curse of knowledge, which is when you have so much knowledge about something, like a master's degree and 20 years of experience and a doctorate about something, what's it like to be in the headspace of people who have no idea what that is? And you're mentioning the acronym soup, and we probably all at some point played student affairs acronym bingo. And some of these things are just not a lot of acronyms and insider knowledge. Sometimes it's confusing. I mean, I talk with people who aren't in higher education about ACPA, and they say, what does that stand for? And I say, College Student Educators International. And they look at me like I've got three heads. not only is that a lot of acronyms, it's not, doesn't fit, and NASPA is the same. So how do we begin to do that? And then also a great point about the profession isn't what it once was, and that's changing and adjusting. And is that a permanent shift? Is that a thing for now? And how do we represent all these different competing things? And that's super challenging. We have students who are coming from multiple different institutions, going to different grad schools, who will work at completely different institutions. And then Amy, you've got the mixed people from 50 different states and 7 different continents, kind of bringing all of that in. Any other thoughts on some of the suggestions you would have for folks who are thinking about designing these courses?
You know, Keith, one other thing I might add is, and it sort of tags into what Erich was just talking about, is we often in both our graduate programs, and I think a lot of times in these undergraduate courses, frame the work in traditional 4-year institutions. And it made me think about Joan Hurt's work on Where You Work Matters. And while some of her information is a little dated now, there's still really good relevancy to help students who are thinking about the field consider where they might work. It's not all 4-year public flagships and small private liberal arts. And so I think that's another thing to think about in course design, is how do you introduce students to those different institutional types? What does work look like on those campuses? And to Erich's point, what does diversity, inclusion, and or social justice look like in those different settings as well?
Mm-hmm.
And Brenda, I would just quickly echo 2 things there. One, we found in our research that was a big piece that our participants named, was that thinking about institutional type. It just wasn't on their radar. And some of it was the reflection piece. Wow, now I understand sort of how being at a liberal arts institution aligns with who I am. Others, it was just they had no clue about the history. But it also then translated into some decision making about fit. Meaning where I might go, I have more of a sense of why I may or may not fit in different places. And one last piece just to amplify that Erich made me think about is the politics of all this stuff and those sort of landmines that we may not think about if you bring a particular set of assumptions about higher ed to your work. Like if you are guided by a social justice lens, but you're in an institution that is very marketplace driven, and who then might teach that course and the ways that those experiences could collide around philosophy, it could get politically a little curious at times. And so that's something just to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's such a great connection between what Erich was bringing up around social justice and where our students and individuals ready, where are the institutional readiness, and then also the politics of that and how we frame things, not making sure we're having the conversations we want to have, but what are students ready for, what are they looking for, and how do we begin to move some of that forward. Other folks want to jump in here with some suggestions and recommendations for folks who are thinking about this, or maybe folks who are about to launch this. What do you know now that you wish you would have known when you started?
I think one of the things that comes to mind is I've been hearing you all share, and we've touched on these a little bit, but experiential opportunities within a course. I think that if it hasn't been overemphasized already, like it's one of the hardest parts of the MOOC is we can say, go do this, go shadow someone, do an informational interview, try for a leadership position, things like that. But if that running alongside an academic course, you're making me put on my student success hat. We know that is so integrative to learning. And so I'm just hearing that repeatedly in my mind as if you're designing a course, how are students in the course able to experience beyond what they already have, what the profession can be like, and specifically at different institutions, how do we get them? We do this with our graduate students. You know, we try to send them to different institutional types to understand different organizations, different functioning of different types of universities. How are we doing that at the undergraduate level? For a taste of it, I think is something that I would recommend for someone who's thinking about this.
Yeah. And how do we get students beyond what their experience is? I think many students would take these courses have sort of had a singular route, been an RA for 3 years, or been in fraternity sorority life the whole time and don't even know what RAs do, or been an orientation leader, or been a peer educator in health and wellness. So how do we get these students who have sort of, this is my experience of student affairs and I'm really interested to sort of understand more broadly? Any other things you wish you would have known when you started this? Maybe we can head off some common errors in some of these folks who are listening.
I think one thing that I would say is to make sure that, and you would think this goes without saying, but I think it's important to know, is that if you're a practitioner who's thinking about developing this course, make sure you have a strong relationship with the higher education program at your institution or within the region. So if you don't have a higher education program at your institution, find somewhere in the region, connect with them over coffee, and think about how your course complements but doesn't complicate what they will get in a later experience if they decide to do that. I just think that is just incredibly important, to make sure that collaboration is there. And then for faculty, to make sure you're collaborating with practitioners. That's going to be your gateway to the students who are going to enter into these courses. And so are you connecting with those who work in residence life, judicial programs, fraternity sorority life, and other different areas where you will draw potential students for these classes? So making sure that those collaborative partnerships between academic units and administrative units is there, I think is really critical.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to begin moving here to our close. We've got 6 of you here with lots of great wisdom and insight, and we really appreciate what you shared so far. I think we'll just go one by one and have you share any closing or final thoughts, things that maybe you wish we would have gotten to, but we didn't quite have time, a resource that you like to recommend, or something that's just that the conversation you're hearing from others is bringing up. So we're just going to randomly start with Amy. What is it that you would like to leave viewers with as a thought, an insight, a recommendation?
So I hear 2 things from this conversation: that courses like this help students figure out that they may not go into student affairs, and that's as powerful as helping those who want to go into student affairs. And I don't want to dismiss that. I think that that's so critical to the future of our profession, and potentially impacting that 60% retention rate. And then the second thing is that I think no matter what a student is taking, whether it's an in-person, a MOOC, an online course, it's supplemented through a leadership curriculum with a position, that it is followed up with those reflective opportunities with a supervisor and with peers to really be able to hash out the big questions that are coming up as we help our undergraduate students explore what next happens in life, when I always used to say the real world happens. So those are the 2 things that I'm taking away from this.
Great. And Brenda, you have lots of experience teaching and researching on this. What's kind of sitting with you as we have been having this conversation?
Yeah, one of the things that just struck me is we've thrown a lot of stuff out today, and it could be overwhelming for someone who's thinking about moving forward with proposing a course. And what I would say about that is, you know your campus, you know your students. Take that knowledge as you think about designing a course to know what you should and can best accomplish. Because you probably, depending on structure, might not be able to do everything that we just talked about in the last 45 minutes. And so really trying to prioritize what you want the course to be and what you want students to get out of it, taking into account what you know about your students. And I think the other thing tied to the convincing a department or a college to take on this additional course is the point, and I've heard several people mention it, these aren't necessarily recruitment plans for our own programs on our own campuses. And so how do you sell the idea of the program, realizing that your aim isn't about increasing enrollment in your own graduate program?
Mm-hmm. That's got to be hard to manage, particularly for folks who are really struggling to get students to enroll in their graduate program.
Well, and so in that case, it might be a good way to get people in.
Great. Darren, what's kind of weighing with you that you'd like to really share with folks?
I would say we didn't say this, but again, goes without saying, have well-defined outcomes. Really think about what are your intentions before you come up with this course. And some of those intentions may be met with literature outside of higher education, especially as we're thinking about courses where there's going to be some type of transferability. And then as you're able, don't rush yourself. You know, really take some time and really think about, as you develop these outcomes, where is the literature that's going to bring this together? Pedagogically, how does this best come together? Because what you don't want to do is, in the excitement, rush this and it not come off the way you intended it to.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And Erich Archer, what suggestions or recommendations would you have for our viewers?
Sure. Really, I have two, and when one's already been said, I think in the intentionality piece is really important. Is what are we trying to accomplish with these courses? And so, if we're, you know, a lot of times, if we're a student affairs practitioner or we're a higher ed student affairs faculty member, we have this zeal for the field, and we want to lead students into it, and we want to focus it on student affairs. But you know, if I have a criminal justice major in my course, are there still things that he or she might be able to get that are important, leadership skills, development, that sort of thing, even if that person is not going to go into the field? And I think the second thing is really, I think you have to be creative. That's the thing I would encourage. And so, you know, we talked about, you know, how does this fit into faculty loads? You know, is it going to be a full-time faculty member teaching it? Well, it doesn't have to be always. Like Susan mentioned, it might be graduate students that develop this. I know that programs I've been associated with, we've had our doctoral students who don't often have a chance to teach in our department because we're a graduate-only department. They teach those undergraduate courses for internship credit or for college teaching credit. So it gives them experiences. So I would just encourage people to be creative.
Well, I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that creativity. That's something that really hasn't come up. You just mentioned one example of that, about who might teach the courses. Are there other areas that you might suggest people explore some of that creativity?
Yeah, I think that, you know, some things have been said already by others. I mean, I think Darren's comments about, you know, what information are we including in the courses? And so not just going to the student affairs source work, I think that's important, but, you know, where are some other places we can go to expose students to these ideas that are sort of complementary or parallel? I think, you know, another is the kind of experiences that we're offering in these courses. And so, you know, job shadowing's been mentioned, you know, experiential opportunities. So I think you really have to, again, go back to the intentionality and think about what is it that I want to accomplish, and then think about some best ways to get at that.
Awesome. Awesome. Erich Pitcher, listening to the conversation, what would you want to leave folks with today?
Well, when I heard folks talking about the sort of marketing recruitment aspect, it made me want to sort of flip and say, what if we thought about these as about relationship building? That if we didn't think about them as while our institution's desire is that we have big, large, full programs, part of how we get there is not always through our marketing efforts. It's actually through the relationships that we build with individuals and the goodwill that we foster through that process. So if we thought about the course as a meeting, as a relational kind of experience, how do we get people more deeply connected to each other? Because oftentimes I think what brings people to student affairs is that they were feeling isolated and alone and struggling, and then they had this magical experience that got them connected either with other peers or with leaders within their institution. And so how do we think about the course from a relationship building perspective? And I think so I think building on Erich Archer's point about creativity, one of the strategies that I've been using in all of my classes is using stories as a way to begin a conversation about what brings you here and what are you hoping to get out of this? So how do we start to develop our own narratives and our own stories so that we can articulate that to others? So relationships and stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point to go back to what Amy's saying about not just building in experiential activities in the course and giving them a chance to reflect. Those narratives and those storytelling is not only a great way for relationship building, it helps them make meaning of the experiences they've already had through a conduct hearing, through an orientation leader experience, and all of those things. So capitalizing on the student experience that they're bringing into the classroom and using that as an opportunity for some guided reflection. Great suggestions there, Erich. And Susan, what would you suggest for folks?
A couple quick thoughts. One, to the politics point we talked about, it reminds me that when I taught master's students, they would sometimes start to feel a little disillusioned as they saw kind of the curtain pulled back on the wizard. And I think some of that can occur with undergraduate courses as well. Students can start to look at their institution a little bit differently and use their voices maybe a little differently. Personally, I feel we should lean into that, but not everyone might. So I think acknowledging that. Another is we are naming this course and what we're talking about as an intro to student affairs, but to keep in mind programs that you're a part of or how you might approach it might be more of a higher ed leadership, and sort of thinking about the distinctions of what do you want to expose students to, because it's a slightly different experience if you are reaching beyond a traditional student affairs framing and you might then have a different set of experiences that gets into a provost's office or other areas on campus, or thinking about facilities and finance and some of those realms. So I think understanding the scope of what you're doing. And a last is to echo that you don't have to take on the whole kit and caboodle. And I think if you pilot some of these ideas as even a workshop series that then might grow into like a 15-week course, or even how you structure it. These can be pre-service trainings. You can think about how you use internships. You might even partner with just a couple offices like a career development or student activities. So I think there's ways that you can apply everything we've talked about, from differentiated curriculum to reflective practice, in building blocks.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I so appreciate you coming in at the end with, what do we call this? And even in naming this particular episode, what are we going to call this? But what you name these courses has a huge impact on what students' perception is, what they sign up for, what they come into, what their expectations are. Really important. The three things that I'm taking away is just good education. One is to make sure you know what your outcomes are. Start there and then create the structure. Don't flip that around. Have it be experiential, which is just good learning and facilitating good learning. And then a part that Erich Pitcher brought up from the very beginning, make sure that it's valuable, intrinsically valuable, not just for future student affairs professionals, but intrinsically valuable for folks. And Susan, you just named some of the other roles in higher ed that this could lead to, but also these are great skills for people who are leading nonprofits, who are doing lots of different work in lots of different areas. So I think there's just a lot of opportunities for these courses to be valuable, which then again might take into consideration in what you name it as well. Well, I'm grateful for all 6 of you for your time today and your great contributions and your experience and your wisdom and your insight as panelists. Also, thanks to the producers behind the scenes and Brian, who's been tweeting along at the HigherEdLive hashtag. You can receive reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the HigherEdLive newsletter or browse our archives at higheredlive.com. Again, I'm Keith Edwards, guest hosting for Heather Shea. Thanks again to the fabulous panelists today and to everyone who is watching. Make it a great week. Thank you all.